Thank you for joining me today to talk about Project Analysis Day 1, Finding Your Project in a Jumble of Data. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Sophia Vargas. I am a research analyst and program manager within Google's Open Source Programs office. I'm also a member of the CHAOSS community, and in both of these spaces, I get to talk to project leaders about building and defining metrics to better understand things like project and community health. In terms of the focus of this talk today, you notice I'm saying day 1, where day 0 in sort of the exercise of maybe building a metrics program, you would start with, say, understanding what your goals and objectives are. It's really hard to set measurements and metrics against unknown constructs. So first you might want to start with that exercise, but then once you have that settled, you know what you might want to measure, now you actually have to go out and find the data in order to create that measurement. Some of the inspiration behind this talk was from a project that I did last year. I work at Google, and in the end of the year, I was tasked to comb through our 11,000 public repositories hosted on both GitHub and GitOnBorg, which is our internal Git hosting service that we also have public-facing repositories on, like Android. And with the goal to be able to tell how many projects were still active that were released and now still managed under the Google umbrella. And as many of you might know, sometimes projects can equal one repository, sometimes projects can equal many repositories. So I set about doing this in all the automated ways that I could think of and still ended up reading through way too many thousand lines of GitHub URLs. So I wanted to kind of share some of the things that I observed from doing that exercise, because I also felt that the same is true from the inverse, how you might define a project from the top down versus the bottom up in terms of what you actually need to count. And so one thing that I assumed first is, okay, how can I use organizations as a proxy? How many projects does that actually work for? Here I'm talking about GitHub organizations as the construct on GitHub, which is kind of like in a filing system, a way to bucket and group things. And in some cases I saw organizations that equaled organizations, say like the Apache community, organizations that were entirely just one project, say Tekton. Organizations could also be a format to group related initiatives. Say the research team at Google uses this organization to release some of their data sets that are part of their initiatives. And then there's also cases where projects are just too big for one organization. And here are 4 organizations associated with the Kubernetes community. Fun fact, I think there are more, but when I ran a query for some of my teammates last year, these were the 4 organizations that were of interest based on the question that we had. So I stepped back and I was like, okay, maybe I need to think about this problem a little bit more theoretically. You might notice I have a math background, so I like to try to solve it in theory, and then we'll try to solve it in practice. So if I'm having trouble establishing what's in and out of a project, maybe if I should just start thinking about the project in theory. Okay, we have an asset, could be a code base, it could be a data set, metrics like CHAOSS community. Then we have the people that work on it, one person, many people submitting code, writing documentation, running meetings. There's so many different ways people can get involved. And then all the dependencies from other libraries and packages, the infrastructure we depend on for build and test, and the funding related to everything in terms of running the project, from the infrastructure to your Zoom subscription. Now, if you look about the same structure from the perspective of a data source, most commonly I get to work with a lot of data coming out of GitHub APIs, where your project is going to look like a repository or many repositories and organizations. You can't really count people, you can count GitHub accounts, and then if you have a mapping to people or bots, tags and metadata that are coming through the schema that can help be more descriptive, and probably the thing that you're most interested in counting. But this still wasn't really enough in terms of trying to define how we should be counting specific orgs, repositories, or various assets and file types as part of the project. And so, again, when you're looking at this project from the top down and the bottom up, it can be really difficult to associate a relationship between a repository via the log alone, because you're mostly dealing with, again, the name and the payload information. So I'm going to take an example here. If anyone recognizes this mascot, it's for representing the Golang project and programming language. And a few years ago, I was working with some of the Golang community leaders on creating a metrics program to better understand their community growth and retention of new contributors. So initially, we started with the Golang organization on GitHub, because that's one of the primary ways that they interact with the external facing community. So the 55 repositories under Golang. But initial conversations, I discovered from some of our project leaders that they also wanted to include a couple of other projects, say Play with Go, which is a hands-on interactive tutorial for the programming language, and Delph, which is a debugger for the programming language that was used predominantly during the QA cycles before release. And so what quickly became apparent to me, and there were others on this list for the record, is that just the Golang organization alone did not fully represent the community as they saw it. There were other components, there were other projects in the extended ecosystem that had become part of the core operational nature of the community. And so immediately my thought was, okay, so if I didn't have this one person who happened to know these things and happened to know this is how the project works, could I find this in the wild? Probably not. So what if project owners kept a record of what things were actually part of the community and what work was just happening in the wild? One example here, if you followed the trajectory of the OpenStack community, there was one point in time where there were so many projects under that umbrella, and it was just spreading out contributions, and it was harder for all these projects to be sustained. So the central governing body of that project decided to set a designation of core projects so that they could direct people to help make sure that the core of that community was still vibrant and active. But there's also, because of the nature of open source and the license that you put on top of your code base, there can be a lot of other stuff that's being developed in the wild that has no relationship to your project, and that's completely fine. But sometimes those things will come back and actually end up serving your broader community. So another example here was I had a lot of trouble isolating the borders of languages and frameworks. Because as you can imagine, you might build a library. In the wild, you might write a plugin to interact with your platform. You might build a tooling or utility that extends the functionality of what we're talking about. So for example of how this can get a little bit muddy, I ran a basic query against GitHub Archive, which is a comprehensive collection of the event stream coming out of GitHub hosted. We have a version of it hosted on BigQuery. It's also a prominent data set used in other reporting tools like DevStats for the CNCF community. And in 2021, against this table, I wanted to count the number of activities related to repositories with a repository name like Angular. Here it's kind of like the open-ended regex function where you're just anything that has Angular in it, but everything around it is counted. And as you can see, the top 10 results, a lot of these things look like they're part of the central Angular project in terms of their organizational listing here, organization/repository name. But we also see things that look like they're coming out of other communities, from personal repositories, and it requires more investigation to better understand how these things actually relate to the Angular community, if they relate at all. So as you might have figured out at this point, my primary observation here was that there does not seem to be any systematic way to name and group things on GitHub. And this is because, yes, there are highly regimented organizational structures. One of my favorite is the Dewey Decimal System for library organization. But most of the time, these things can be highly subjective, personal, and they're going to change over time. This is a picture of my cats on a chilly day in October trying to find the most optimal way to snuggle on a cold day. This is all from one day. Just as they were moving around trying to figure out what worked for them. And so something that I observed at the end was that the naming actually seemed to mirror the community more than the project, which was hard for me to accept at first. As an analyst, I usually try to group things as logically as possible, especially when I look at sort of grouping of open source projects. I usually start with, what do they do? What are the functionality of it? Who is it for? How do we group the user base? What is it doing in the infrastructure stack and the developer stack? And really trying to think functionally about what these things are and group them logically that way. But now that we know that it's not actually going to be logically ordered that way, when I shared this idea with one of my colleagues, he pointed out that this individual, Melvin Conway, had already come up with this concept in 1967. Where he observed that organizations tend to design systems that mirror their own communication structure over their operational or functional structure. And so here, as I was going through this mass of randomly named repositories, I found that there was a lot of commonalities here, and that this Conway's law is in fact still holding true in something as organic as open source naming. And so one thought that I had was, wait, well, what if a project could designate a standard naming criteria? So we could definitively or intuitively know what to include or not include in any of our analysis related to a project. But then the more I thought about it, the more I didn't like it. And that's because when we looked at that last slide, looking at the angular permutations, we learned a lot of context from how things were named, say maybe where they came from, what organization, institution, or company created it, or maybe what other language or framework it was related to, or what use case it was designed to fill. And that's a lot of context around affiliation. So I struggle to think about ways that we can improve naming in our organizational structures while still preserving the organic nature of where these things came from. And I think it really came down to the fact that I need to let go of functional organizations when I think about these types of projects. And maybe why the project exists has a larger impact on the structure than what the project is in itself. And this is an idea that is also shared by one of my former colleagues, Julia Ferrioli, presented a thought project I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, called the social model of open source. And I really like this idea where she proposes another type of classification structure instead based on the purpose of the project, not necessarily what the project is. So are you making it why are you open sourcing this thing? Is it for collaboration? Is it to educate people? Is it to facilitate something or experimentation? And there can be many reasons why the thing ends up being an open source project. And to me, that might have a bigger impact on, say, how these things might evolve in the wild. So I wanted to close with a few ideas that clearly, I'm not telling you have to do them. I'm just thinking about the perspective of someone like me who 5 years later is going to have to repeat this exercise. Wouldn't it be great if project owners were, say, a little bit more forthcoming with how they wanted their project to be used and interacted within the community, how they wanted people to either come to their project and contribute or fork their project and take it somewhere else, and having a little bit more upfront guidance, thinking about that social model of open source. What are we trying to do with this thing that can help guide people that how they should be interacting with you, how they should be attributing back to your project? And what if we maintained a record of all the things that were part of the project's critical components? And this could be useful not just for the analysts in the room who are trying to come up with a number and need a definitive set of things to count, but also maybe if you're new to the project, maybe if you're evaluating it potentially as a use case. If you're just looking at a repository, you might be missing a lot of context because there's all these other components, pieces, libraries, extensions that could be somewhere else out there on GitHub or another hosting site that are not necessarily easily discoverable. So can we design a better way to keep a record of this? Because it is going to evolve over time. And sometimes you might end up with an incredible piece of history, not just how the code base itself evolved. From the perspective of analysts, I always like to remind people, please list what you are counting and how you are counting it. I've seen many different types of dashboards and insights dashboards out on the web. And if you are like me, I will go through with one project and compare all of the dashboards against each other, and sometimes the numbers don't match, and I don't always know why. And sometimes it's because they're counting their dependency chains and all their, say, pull requests or individual contributors around those chains, or maybe, again, thinking about the Golang example, they're just including the central Golang repository. They're not including these other components. But again, that's really subjective based on what your goals are, what you're trying to learn, but just tell us what it is so that we know how to interpret these numbers. And if we say we want to recreate it in 5 years, we know how to do that. And then just a recognition that anytime we are building any kind of analysis around a project, we're essentially looking at a footprint in this data source, which is really just very two-dimensional when you think about it. It's just one view of your project, and a fairly narrow view in itself. There's so many other places that activity can be happening, less along the personal interactions that are happening right now at this conference that are not going to be captured in these spaces. So I always like to remind people, please acknowledge your subset and let us know what you're measuring.